Okay, this lesson for the Cornet Project class specifically identifies the advantages that we've enjoyed, the relief, if you will, and as often stated, the hermeneutics that we were taught at the seminary was a holistic approach, and Dr. John Penn encouraged including all the information. And formally, one chief feature of his hermeneutic is called the Unification Theory. We probably all have heard someone say, I can take any argument out there or any controversy and build a better argument. Well, it was likely in the seminary, that is, where the school had been built 1934. It's the oldest Bible school in Arkansas. And men had worked there as pastors and served as professors. So their view was always ecclesiastical. They didn't forget that what they were teaching, studying had to do with a higher calling and accomplishment, pastoring one of the Lord's New Testament churches. And you may not hear much about that. So oftentimes during that training, we would hear people say, students would hear men who were competent, skilled, had the aptitude, let's say, in language, in hermeneutics, in systematic theology, and had a vast array of knowledge, so they could pull that together. And so just for a moment, I'll read this. So formally, it's called the Unification Theory. And why I found it was interesting, because I was often encouraged by Dr. John Penn. If you ever worked with him or any of the professors, Dr. John Owen, Dr. Randy Murray, for example, challenge anything they say. Dr. David Robinson especially said, question everything, deconstruct everything, look at it from any view. He said it will endure the evaluation. So it says here that if we find we have two theories, and we often see this, which explain two apparently different behaviors, we might find it possible to replace both those theories with a single theory, which still manages to explain both of those things we observed or things we hear taught. When this happens, the process is called unification. Now, what I liked about this in looking this up was it's in a book. I'll put the information or a link to the book. It's a little e-book. I don't even know if it's $1. It might be even just 99 cents, but it said the resultant unified theory will be simpler than either of the two previous theories, as it reveals a deeper underlying truth. This process of unification always represents a landmark in this case, physics. This is the field of physics. It's like drawing a line in the sand, but I like the word landmark there, since where I pastor is Landmark Missionary Baptist Church. It's like drawing a line in the sand. It shows we have reached a new level of understanding. We will never have to go back to our previous level of ignorance. Now, I remember my level of ignorance. It was unsurpassed. It's actually worse than a level of ignorance. I had been so primed by so many different things. I could not at one time distinguish jargon from Bible categories, so that when we were encouraged to have lexical support, that was always pointing us back to the Bible words, the context in which those words appear, and then to notice the difference between usage and meaning. So, for example, when we've heard the open, closed, and I'll just make a list. So here, let's just put open. And we've heard this. And for those of you that are actually in here in this class, you notice this open versus closed. These are competing theories. Well, we were given the opportunity to notice living God, living theism, which finds us freed from these competing. So you remember we were all brought and invited into this conversation, whether you want it or not. And we, of course, as pastors, we have people that might come in who are unscrupulous, as we had, and their interest was just to catalyze friction, discourage people, because they could pick a side, but they couldn't posit a text. I'll say it again. they could pick a side, but they were incompetent and inept to posit a text, so that picking sides, when it was noticed by those who had no character, who were lewd and base, for example, craftily induced false brethren, they began to be energized by how much um, social currency they could generate at the expense of Christ, at the expense of his church, at the distress of his flock, the consequence which was not their responsibility. So the young and the old, so we learned, I'll just write it here. You can look this up. We have a rationale for how could the earth chronologically be one age and yet geologically another. Dr. Al Mohler, I'll put a link to his article as well. He was really looking for the words. Now, he's unsurpassed scholar, from what I'm told, and renowned in his reputation, and stood and made a bold statement recently at the Southern Baptist Convention where he was challenging and appealing to the convention not to go back and establish a committee for every single word in their confession of faith, because he said then we won't have one. And he said, but if we don't remember or know what it meant or what the Baptists meant when we said what we said, then we are people who are, I think he was warning they're going to be adrift. So he was looking for words and a way to show this. So as Dr. John Penn taught us, his research assistants, Dr. Eddie Johnson and myself, working with him, for him, and under the purview of his guidance, we were always reminded, define your terms. Well, that's a little harder than we think, and some of you have noticed it almost becomes frustrating until you learn how to do it, and then it becomes liberating. So we learned the divine ratio, so there was really no reason. So when you saw these two competing, you saw what came from it. So this is what they meant in the seminary. The professors, for example, a friend of mine, Dr. Philip Miller, were he to take his expertise and aptitude in language, hermeneutics, his background in systematic, his years now of serving as both pastor and professor, the degree of difficulty becomes self-evident that there's a large gap between what he would deal with out there and what I call the commercialized Christianity, that often can be used. The level of entry, the threshold of entry is so low. And that's why more people can be right than smart. More people can pick sides than posit text. More people can enjoy the social, garner social attention and form a little circle, if you will, an in group, which always seems to become unethical in their practices. And certainly they don't want to edify the body. But so many people can enter this is such a low threshold. But to go in and find context from the Torah to the Apocalypse, to go in and find the relevance to the decay rate, the life span, the amount of time we would be dying. Adam was told dying, so he'd be dying for 1,000 years, and he would no longer live outside that 1,000 years. So we noticed all that. So then 3, of course, we were taking the either ors, which we learned of those, the either ors, and that was the same as the all or nothings, the all or nothing. And it presents itself in several ways, those false dichotomies. And we learned about that regeneration precedes faith. Well, we noticed now that was actually, it follows believe and precedes believing. Now that's explicitly the case. Dr. R.C. Sproul was saying not temporally, but rather logically prior, but we have explicitly it occurs here. And we learned why, because nothing would take the place of the gospel in nothing. So whether it be in heralding the good news, so that through the gospel So we saw the gospel was essential. Even Al Mohler once had to say, or found it necessary, and I don't know in what world you're in, where a Bible teacher, seminary professor, a pastor would have to say, oh no, you need the gospel for regeneration. Well, that would actually make the gospel, it indicated that the gospel had been somewhat cast away. And we were always taught not to remove the ancient landmarks, and the gospel is certainly nothing we want to move. So the fact that it's positioned prior to one who believes, simple form of action, that's why we preach what Acts 20:21 says, a mind in association with God is or equals a mind in association with, that is, faith in Jesus Christ, the Lord of us. So we don't have the need to place something ahead of the gospel or find, and it's a negative externality. For example, we're taught to define our terms, notice our errors of omission. Errors of omission, where we can have blind spots. The late R.C. Sproul mentioned how he acquired the blind spot of regeneration precedes faith and how it contradicted what he had already known to be true. The gospel, we would be fathered through the gospel. Dr. James R. White mentions blind spots, and very few would have the aptitude to notice the difference between believe and believing unless you actually use your English Bible. For example, John 20:31 in the English Bible, the last Bible with the blood of the Baptists, the martyrs, the persecution, that last Bible that was forged in fire, if you will, and the rest have been through technology and computer, whatever you call all that. So that if you noticed in John 20:31, it distinguished clearly believe and believing, and it's very noteworthy because it replaces and places again the gospel where it belongs. So we need to be aware of negative externalities. So what we've learned is it really is irrelevant to us, whatever it would be, whether it be a blind spot or whether it be some implicit expression where it's only logical prior that regeneration precedes faith, but it's not explicitly stated, because we know in the Bible that at no place in any Koine text do we find the regeneration prior to believe, the punctual action, simple form of action. So we never find it. Well, that places the gospel in preeminence. So when your interpretation starts to diminish, let's say, I'll just write here, diminish gospel, well, more rather, the Christ, the Jesus Christ of that gospel, then your construct is taking priority over Christ. And again, remember, this is our 5 points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you really want to know what this is all about. There, and that's CHRIST. So anything that begins to, let's say, suppress, press down, diminish, marginalize, for example. So we marginalize constructs only because we take and apply the unification theory within the purview of the holistic approach taught as Dr. John Penn, a pastor and a preacher and a father to children, a husband to his wife, now a grandfather, now a great-grandfather, and a legacy of working in and through and according to the New Testament ecclesia. So again, this is just to show you that there's a lot of relief that comes. You don't have to go back and ever be exasperated by this, because I noticed something interesting to me as a social scientist. I noticed people would be caught in the young and old who weren't even able to lead out originate their assertion from the text. So I, in my naivete, was asking someone, to help me understand what they meant when they said young earth. And they were just beside themselves because they were just simply unprepared for someone to believe that they might believe what they're saying. And that's often the case. People can tout. Some people can even say they're a Baptist because someone placed them underwater, but it may not indicate anything about the implication of an ecclesia baptizing someone into the ecclesia that is Christ. Ephesians 5:32 limits the ecclesia as Christ. It's our fellowship is into the gospel, which is all about Christ. So this is just to explain and help give some formal structure to what it is to be relieved and have all of this enjoyment, because we just can go down the list. And if you'll set it up like this, draw yourself a triangle. Here's your two competing. And then take this one. And again, remember when you think, well, is this a legitimate process? Just notice, I'll put notice, the Trinity. And notice that in the Trinity, the competing theories are monotheism and polytheism, which both of these without Trinity. So someone might say, well, I'm monotheistic, but you deny the Trinity, or polytheism, obviously, is multiple gods, multi-gods. So this is, you say, well, you're either one God or many gods. Well, that's not all there is to it, because we have the one here, let's just write out, one being, three persons, co-equal, co-eternal. So that eliminates, I'll just put subtraction here, that eliminates subordinationism. It eliminates modalism, which, if you don't know about that, you really need to look at that. That's a horrible thing people teach. And it makes us never again, it eliminates a false monotheism. And it dismisses completely, nullifies polytheism. And you never have to go back to those that are quiet. So if you're saying, well, I just don't know if this is well, the Trinity demonstrates our ability to start with the apex of apologetics, for example. So as I would say, monotheism, and let's just put sub 2, so it's a sub kind. It doesn't include Trinity, or it might include modalism and all those things. And then, or we have polytheism. So when you're doing this, always go back and remind yourself that, and it does appear to me that why was the work not completed? And part of that, and the work I mean is, if you can grasp the Trinity and you can understand the highest level of thought, the highest understanding, which makes these things much lesser, then just finish your work. And like I said, I was highly favored to be in the seminary whose faculty were pastors, so professors were not disconnected from the covenant communities over which they had the responsibility to oversee and oversight. And they were training men to go out and pastor. And they certainly weren't training us to pick sides. We already knew how to do that. They were teaching how to outwardly posit text. So the picking of sides is not the positive text, but that's enough. It's just to give you somewhat of a understanding of one of the chief features in the historical, holistic, there we go, holistic hermeneutic. And the chief feature being the unification theory, or the product. So when you notice that you're producing something that makes the rest obsolete, it's not to make, I'm not called to go outside the ecclesia and obsolete and try to tear down whatever these formed categories are that people are using, these false dichotomies. No, I'm teaching in the ecclesia. There's a class I've been teaching since 1988 there at the covenant community where my wife was. That's, I guess, the only church she ever knew. So anyway, you have a blessed day. Enjoy this lesson, but it's called the Unification Theory. Let me get out of the way so you can see it. And you can see that as you have competing theories, the two at the bottom, like the open, the closed theism, you can result in knowledge of living theism. Young or old, you can result in knowledge of divine ratio. The either or, all or nothingism can be dispelled, such as precede or regeneration precedes faith. You can notice that might be implicitly or implied through quite a labor of trying to synthesize multiple texts, different genres, but since it's not explicitly stated, I'm not really sure. No one's told me why it has, whatever compelled that to be something to then take scriptures to use, subordinate to support it. I have no idea. All it means to me, and those of you who study the Bible, is that if it's not there explicitly, then it's because it doesn't have to be and it's not necessary. So that's why you can teach these things that have context, Bible categories, Bible words, Bible meanings. You can stay focused on what we're called. And now this is for the context of a covenant community. Outside that, I'm not really sure. I certainly wouldn't have left a career, multiple careers to engage in with people who just pick sides. I was trained to posit text and to pastor the Lord's ecclesia and be entrusted with this. So it's a high calling, and it's why our perspective in the seminary when you're professors or pastors is much higher, much more sacred, much more holy, much more honorable, much more weight. So have a blessed day. Enjoy this lesson.